Hey world history students, it's time for another lesson. Now we've been talking a lot about kings and queens that have absolute power over the people in their countries, but there's a time in history known as the Age of Enlightenment. Now, it didn't just start in one time, like they didn't wake up and say, hey, it's the Age of Enlightenment, but scholars look back now and they say, well, it was a period from about 1720 to about 90. Yeah, something like that, 1790. And it's during this time period that the really smart people in Europe, all these scholars, they decide they're going to put more faith and they're going to listen more to reason and to science than in kings and queens who think they know everything, and in the church, because the church always claims to know what's right and what's wrong. But now the scholars are like, well, let's look at the scientific method and let's see if we can reason things out. My favorite writers during this time period, the Age of Enlightenment, was this Frenchman. His name was François-Marie Arouet, and he wrote some really famous plays. He goes by the name Voltaire, and that's how history remembers him. Voltaire was able to put all of his thoughts and how he felt about the government and about church, and he would write them into funny plays and put them on display in the theaters throughout Paris and other places in France. And all of a sudden people would come and they would laugh at these plays and they'd realize, wow, this guy's making lots of sense, you know. He's making fun of the king, he's making fun of the church, but you know what? He makes a lot of sense. And Voltaire got into some trouble too with the king of France at that time, who was Louis XV. He spent some time in prison twice for stuff that he wrote in his plays. But he came up with something he called the principles of enlightenment. And he said there are 5 things that this should be like the foundations of being really enlightened people. The first one was called reason. And that means your ability to think things out, this logical thought process that leads you to logical conclusions. Why just listen to the church or the king when you can reason it out yourself? The second has to do with nature. Voltaire believed in God, even though he criticized the church. And he said nature is put around us and everything works out logically in nature. We should follow more of nature to make sense of things. The third thing is, and this is a big one, happiness. He felt that God put humans in this world to be happy, not to accept the spot in life where they have to be laborers and be the subjects of kings and queens. They should pursue happiness. This is where this pursuit of happiness comes from that we talk about all the time in the United States of America. We have the right from God to be happy with the things that we do in this world. The fourth one was called progress. Now that means we should always look to logic and science to make our lives better while we're here on earth. The church hated change. They wanted the status quo to remain. They're in charge. And no matter what science says, they're in charge. Whereas Voltaire thought, no, if we can figure out a better way to live our lives because of science, then we should move in that direction, no matter what the church says. And the last one is liberty. He felt that men and women in this world were brought into the world as free people. They were not the property of any king, any queen, any empire, any government. They were free. Some of the other writers that are my favorites from the Age of Enlightenment include Diderot. Diderot was a Frenchman who believed knowledge was something everyone should possess. And so he made it his goal in life to try to put together as much knowledge on as many different topics as he possibly could find. Mathematics, literature, geology, history, sciences, anything he could find. He wanted to put it all together in one book. Well, come on, you can't get that all in one book. After 20 years of working, what happened was he had about 20 books all together, and he put together the first set of encyclopedias. Now, you guys might know what encyclopedias are, but as a kid, I had a set of encyclopedias. Every house had a set of encyclopedias. You would just look things up. They were put in alphabetical order. Now, you've got Wikipedia and things like that you can look up on your own. Well, it was not very popular. The King of France hated it. He thought it was too much knowledge for common people to possess, and they would think they were smarter than the king. So he would not let Diderot he would not let him publish his works in France. He ended up having to go to England, and England loved it, and they ended up with Encyclopedia Britannica. The next person, Adam Smith, was a Scottishman, and he was an economist and became a college professor. And he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And in this book, he had a lot to say about how government should just keep their hands off of anybody who was in business. He came up with this phrase known laissez-faire, which means leave alone. The government should leave businesses alone and keep their hands off it. It's your business, you make the profit, government should have nothing to do with it. Next, we have a French nobleman. He's known as the Baron de Montesquieu. He actually had his position and his property, all of his wealth, because of the King of France. But the Baron de Montesquieu could see what was going to happen with the French monarchy. They were spending money more than it was coming in. They were on a downward slide, and he really thought the monarchy would come to a violent end unless they repaired the government. And he wrote a book called On the Spirit of Laws. And in his book, de Montesquieu said, we need to go back to the ways of the old Roman Republic, where we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, where there's a balance of power. Executives enforce the law, legislators make the laws, the judicial branch interprets the laws, just like they did in the Roman Empire, and maybe France could be saved and their economy would be saved. Now, the French don't take their advice. The king thinks the Baron is crazy for suggesting it, but you know who did read his book was an American named Thomas Jefferson, and that's why we ended up modeling our new country towards a republic, just like the old Roman Republic. Two really famous English authors in this time period were Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Now, Hobbes and Locke both experienced the English Civil War. If you remember that, that's when Charles I went to war with Parliament, and they fought for 5 bloody years, and then Charles lost his head. They killed their king, and then they had, they had a dictator with Oliver Cromwell for a while, for 11 years, and then the monarchy came back. Well, after this Civil War was over, they thought England was going crazy. They thought this is the worst time in history we could possibly be experiencing. And Hobbes wrote that he thought that all human beings were born selfish and basically wicked, that humans deep down inside are not nice people, that if we don't have any kind of governing, people will always turn to crime. So what he said needs to exist is we need to have a social contract in our government. That means we surrender some of our freedoms to an absolute king. In exchange, the king provides law and order for society. He's like, okay, you don't get all the privileges and rights of being 100% free, but I'll make sure no one gets hurt, okay? You will have law and order. It makes sense, especially in this time period. John Locke said, no, that's not true. I don't believe people are born wicked and selfish. He believed that people learn through all of their life's experiences what is good and what's not so good. And he also said that all humans are born with 3 God-given rights. They have the right to be alive. They have the right to life. They have the right to liberty. And they have the right to, and you're going to say pursuit of happiness, but it's not. He wrote they have the right to own property. That you have things that no one can take away from you. Now, Thomas Jefferson read John Locke, and when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that in there, that we as Americans are born with unalienable rights. We have life, liberty, and property. But when Benjamin Franklin was proofreading the Declaration, he says, you can't write that in there, Tom. You can't put life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson said, well, why not? He said, because some people in these colonies, they see slaves as property, and we want freedom for all men and women in this country. You're going to have to change it to something else. So Thomas Jefferson went back to the writings of Voltaire. He said, I'm going to put the pursuit of happiness in there instead, and that's what he did. The people I want to talk about are Cesare Beccaria and Mary Wollstonecraft. Cesare Beccaria was an Italian. He was a nobleman, and he wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishment. He spent a big portion of his life traveling throughout Europe and seeing how laws were put down and how people were punished when they broke the law. And he thought, we're pretty cruel in this world. He said that we should outlaw torture. We should outlaw capital punishment, to being killed for crimes. He said we have to have punishments that actually fit the crimes. And he wasn't really popular at first, but it will catch on. It catches on first with abolishing torture, they would at least have some kind of quick executions instead of these long drawn out executions. But it will eventually find some merit down the road. Mary Wollstonecraft, she wrote a book, she's English, and she wrote a book called A Vindication on the Rights of Women. She was way ahead of her time. It was published in 1792, 127 years before women in this country got the right to vote. But she wrote in her book that women should be given jobs of responsibility just like men, that women should be able to receive equal education as men. And she also said that women should get involved in politics just like men. All right, well, this age of enlightenment's gonna lead to some moving and some shaking in Europe, and we'll talk about that the next time we get together. We'll see you later.